3 that we read about earlier when he says, and what will be the sign of your coming, your second coming, and of the end of the age? These last two actually end up going together. So the end of the age is the end of the age of the Gentiles, and that's what we're in right now. Because if you read Romans chapter 11, he makes a distinction between those that are in the church and the nation of Israel. All those Old Testament promises that haven't been fulfilled yet for the nation of Israel, they will be when Christ returns, when he ends up coming back. So when he says that the one who endures to the end will be saved, the end refers to the end of the Gentile age. And when Jesus comes back, he's going to set up this millennial reign, this 1,000-year reign of Christ, and he's going to direct his attention once again towards Israel. And in verse 14 it says, the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached. Notice he's using the future tense. That shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. When he says the whole world, the word for whole, it can be translated all, it can be translated throughout, or the entire. For example, in Luke chapter 2, when he's writing about the census with the Roman Empire and everything, and this is when Joseph and Mary had to travel to Bethlehem for the census, he used this word the word for world is translated the inhabited world. So he's saying in verse 14 that the kingdom, the gospel shall be preached throughout all the inhabited world. And then the end will come. Again, referring to the second coming. Now we go to verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Now this verse has, more than any other verse probably in this section, has generated more controversy and different interpretations. So when like any other passage of scripture, we have to handle it with care. Because they'll say, well, this is talking about, he's talking to the apostles because he says you, therefore when you see the abomination of desolation. Now what is he talking about? He's referring to Daniel the prophet. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the abomination of desolation that Jesus is talking about through Daniel the prophet? Well, the word, we have to break it down first. The word abomination, it was Greek. It literally means a foul thing or a detestable thing. It can refer to idols or idolatry, and the term is sometimes used to describe something that's loathsome on account of its stench. So it's the most vile thing. In the Old Testament, the word abomination is used for those who practice homosexuality. In Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22, in fact, God actually compares homosexuality to be no less vile than having sex with animals. I mean, that's how God actually views homosexuality. In Deuteronomy 22:5, he said, it is abomination for a man to wear women's clothes and women to wear men's clothes. So the transgender, or like what we used to call them, transvestites, God considers that to be abomination. Making an idol, Deuteronomy 27, he calls it abomination. In fact, in Revelation chapter 17, the woman is clothed in scarlet red, also known as Babylon the Great. She has something on her forehead, that says Babylon the Great. God calls it an abomination. And desolation, it comes from a Greek word which means to lay waste, to ruin, to strip of possessions or strip of treasures. So what's going to happen is that this detestable, foul thing is going to lay waste or strip possessions of something. So when he says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, it's talking about something foul that's going to take something away, that's going to lay waste to something. And what's going to happen is this is going to happen in the temple of God. But notice how he says, when you see, he's talking about future events. So the question is this a future events when the apostles are still around, or is this future events that's still related to us? With that, I want to have you keep your fingers here if you've got a pew Bible, or you just got that little piece of paper there or whatever, because we're going to come back to it. And we're going to go to Daniel chapter 9, because Daniel chapter 9 and some other passages are going to help us break this down a little bit. And if you have Pew Bible, it's page 637. And we're going to start with verse 26. We don't have to go to verse 24. We'll start at verse 26 because we covered the others and other Bible studies. But this is talking about what's going to be happening in Daniel's future.
What verse did you say?
What's that? Daniel chapter 9, verse 26. Okay, you there? Okay. And it's page 637, I think, in the Pew Bible. Okay. Then after the 62 weeks, there's before I actually we get started, in verse 24, Daniel's prophesying about 70 weeks. And if you look up on the board, a week in the Old Testament in this particular context is a year week, meaning a year week is 1 year. So when it talks about a week, it means a year. When it says 7 years, it means 7 weeks, it means 7 years. When he's talking about 70 weeks, he's talking about 70 years. So when you hear the word weeks, just replace the word weeks with years. Okay, because the weeks literally means a period of 7. That's all it means. Okay. Okay, so he says 70 weeks have been decreed for your people, your holy city. Your people is Israel, your holy city is Jerusalem. So let's drop down to verse 26. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Okay, there's a lot of symbolism here, and it can get really confusing, so I'm going to try to, kind of go slow here and go through a little bit here as well. So one of the questions that people have is in verse 27 when he says, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. Who is the he that they're talking about? A lot of people think that this refers to a future Antichrist, what we've been talking about. There are other people who think that this refers to a person in the past, referring to Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a ruler of the Seleucid Empire that was very cruel to the Jews during the time of the Maccabees, and he even took a pig and sacrificed it on the altar on the second temple. There are some people that think that this is actually talking about Jesus, that Jesus will put a stop to sacrifice, and this happened when he died on the cross. And they'll say that, and people say, well, the word he isn't capitalized. But we have to remember, this is a translation. And they did not have capital letters in Greek back then, especially in the Koine Greek. So we can't actually use that as an example. So what is it? Is it Jesus? Is it Antichrist? Or is it Antiochus Epiphany? Well, when he's writing this, sometimes prophecies can have partial fulfillments. And when Daniel is writing, it's partially fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphany because he did all these things. But if you listen to Jesus, when he's writing in Matthew, he's talking about a future event. So he's talking about something that's happening in his future and the disciples' future. And just to kind of break things down, like it says, he breaks the time period into two different sections. In verse 26, he says, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off. Well, the first set of weeks, or 49 years, 7 times 7 is 49, is a time period that it took to rebuild the temple and the temple wall around Jerusalem. What happened is that the Jews had come back from the Babylonian captivity. If you read Jeremiah, it says that they were there for 70 years. So they come back around 445, and then they get this decree from the king of Persia saying, okay, you can rebuild your temple, you can rebuild your wall. Well, this took 49 years to do, and it ended roughly around 400 BC, which is a time of the Old Testament era when prophecy had ended. This is about the time when inspired Scripture had stopped. The Holy Spirit had stopped being active, in Israel as far as the Old Testament. It'd be another 400 years before it would start back up again. With John the Baptist. So it took 49 years, and then he says, after the 62 years, the Messiah will be cut off. So from roughly around 400 BC, there would be another 62 weeks, or no, 434 years to do the math, and roughly around 30 AD, the Messiah would be cut off. The cut off is a term to describe crucifixion, that he would die, and it was roughly around 32 AD, somewhere around that is when Jesus was crucified. So this prophecy was fulfilled in literal time, and you got to realize Daniel is writing several hundred years before this actually happened. Yeah. So he says, and then he goes on to say in verse 26, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. You know, and in 70 AD, this is when Emperor Nero ended up burning Jerusalem down to the ground. But then it says, and he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. Now, some people think this is the same period of time, that this is talking about the time of Nero, but I want to show you from Scripture, from Daniel himself, that this is not referring to Nero. This did not happen in the first century. It's still yet future. I want you to turn now in Daniel to Daniel chapter 11, verse 30. If you have a Pew Bible, it's 638, so it's just one page over. Obviously, we don't have time to read the whole chapter, so I'm just going to focus on 2 verses. We're going to go down to verse 30. For ships from Kittim will come against him. Therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the holy covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard to those who forsake the holy covenant. So it's saying this individual, this he, that's talked about earlier in chapter 9, becomes enraged at the holy covenant. Well, obviously Jesus is not going to be enraged at the holy covenant unless the Jews are doing something to blaspheme him. And they will show regard for those who forsake the covenant. So individuals that are forsaking the covenant, this individual actually likes this. Now look at verse 31. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. So remember what was said earlier, that this individual put an end to what? Sacrifice. So to do away with sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. So this is not talking about Jesus. Jesus would not do this. If we go to the book of Revelation, we find this is exactly what happens with the Antichrist. So it wasn't talking about the destruction of the temple with Nero in 70 AD. And since we're in Daniel, let's go to the very next chapter, page 640, Daniel chapter 7, and we're going to begin with verse 5. This is actually towards the very end at Daniel.
12.
Daniel 12, verse 5. Yeah, what did I say? Sorry. Yeah, Daniel 12, verse 5. I'm sorry. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, 2 others were standing, one on this bank of the river, and the other on the bank of that river. And one said to the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long will it be until the end of the wonders? Now, if we go back to verse 10, we find out this man that's dressed in linen is none other than Jesus Christ. It doesn't actually say that word, but we've had other Bible studies that this is who it is. So Jesus is actually seeing a pre-incarnate Christ at this point. Verse 7, I heard a man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the river, as he raised his right hand and his left towards heaven, and swore by him, and if you notice, him's capitalized, because the translators understand this is talking about Jesus, who lives forever, that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. Now, if you've been to other Bible studies, you find out that in Revelation chapter 12, time, and half a times refer to 3.5 years. It's the exact same phrase, and it refers to half of the 7-year tribulation period, or that last week that's up on the board. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. Drop down to verse 9. He said, go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end time. So this is not talking about the first century, because the first century was not the end time. The end time is the end of the Gentile age. In verse 11, from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Now, if you go to Revelation, I'm not going to have you go there, but I want to show in Revelation chapter 12, verse 6. it says, then the woman, which the woman is a symbol of the nation of Israel, fled into the wilderness. So John, the Apostle John, is prophesying about a future time when the nation of Israel is being chased by the Antichrist in the wilderness, where she, the nation of Israel, had a place prepared for God so that she would be nourished for 1,260 days, just like Daniel said. And in Revelation, and in chapter 4, or verse 14 of the same chapter, it says, but the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, the nation of Israel, so that she would fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So John is borrowing language from the prophet Daniel that is talking about a future time period that's not taking place in the first century, but taking place in John's future and our future. When there's going to be a 7-year period where the Antichrist is midway through is going to put an end to sacrifice in the temple, because during the tribulation period there's going to be a third temple that's going to be built, and there's going to be sacrifices on it, because what's going to happen prior to this is that the church is going to be taken out of the world. This is what's known as the rapture. The Apostle Paul talks about this in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and 1 Corinthians 15, and Jesus even talks about it when he says, I'm going to go to prepare a place for you in John chapter 14. And when the church is taken out, when the church is raptured up to heaven, then God is going to focus his attention on the nation of Israel again. And it's going to be a period of 7 years. And midway through the 7-year period is when this abomination of desolation that the prophet Daniel talked about, and that Jesus talked about to his disciples, are going to happen. And this would be one of the signs of his coming, the supernatural act that precedes Jesus' return, and what will happen right before the end of the age, right before Jesus comes back and sets up his millennial kingdom. So, comments or questions about any of that? I know that's a lot to swallow. No? Okay. Let's see if there's anything else that I'm missing. Let's see. Like it says, just a note, and it's kind of like repeats a little bit what I said. And then again, this is from the MacArthur Study Bible. When he comments on this, he says, this phrase, abomination, desolation, originally referred to the desecration of the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes, king of Syria, in the 2nd century BC. Antiochus invaded Jerusalem in 168, made the altar into a shrine to Zeus, and even sacrificed pigs on it. However, Jesus clearly was looking forward to a yet future abomination of desolation. Some suggest that this prophecy was fulfilled in AD 70 when Titus invaded Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. However, the Apostle Paul saw a still future fulfillment, 2 Thessalonians 2, as did John, when the Antichrist sets up an image in the temple during the future tribulation. Christ's words here therefore look beyond the events of 70 AD to a time of even greater global cataclysm that will immediately precede his second coming. And in Second Thessalonians chapter 2, what it says, let no one in any way deceive you, for it, referring to the day of the Lord, when all this stuff happens, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. This is the Antichrist, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself to be God. And in Revelation, let's see, I think it's 13, it says, I just want to make sure I've got the right page. Yeah, 13, 14, 15 says, and he, referring to the false prophet, so we understand in context, and the false prophet deceives those who dwell on the earth. Dwell on the earth is a term to describe unbelievers, because of the signs which is given to him to perform in the presence of the beast, meaning the Antichrist, telling those who dwell on the earth, unbelievers, to make an image to the beast, who had the wound of the sword and has come to life. And it was given to him to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast would even speak and cause as many as do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So this is everything that's culminating that Jesus is talking about before he ends up coming back. So if we go back to our text, Matthew chapter 24, and while we're doing that, does anybody have any comments or questions? No? Okay. And as we finish up here, starting with verse 16, Matthew 24:16, Jesus says, "Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in the days, and pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath." There's always some confusion here because they think this is talking about the apostles specifically because he uses the word you, he uses the word your, but we have to understand that we are in the church age right now, and the word your can sometimes be figurative to refer to people that they're identifying with other people. Because you is sometimes figurative and representative. For example, in Matthew chapter 23, verse 35, when he's rebuking the Pharisees, he says, "So that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah." Now, and he says, "whom you murdered between the temple and the altar." The problem is that Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, lived several hundred years before the Pharisees. They couldn't have murdered him because the Pharisees weren't even around, even as a religious sect. They popped up, I think, a couple hundred years before Christ, and Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, lived in like the 400s BC. But what he's doing is that he's identifying them as being just as bad as their forefathers that killed these prophets. I mean, even Abel, we all know Abel was the second son of Adam and Eve. Why would they be responsible for the death of Abel? Because back in verse 31 of Matthew 23, it says, "So you testify against that yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets." So in Matthew 24, when he says, "I pray that your flight will not be in the winter," the "you" refers to Jews during a future period of time when God is focused on the nation of Israel again. And we know this is talking about Israel because it says, "Pray that it may not happen on the Sabbath."
Were those believers?
Yeah, those are believers.
They were that he was talking to?
Yeah, he's talking specifically to believers. And he says, "Pray that it will not happen on the Sabbath." Well, we're in the church age, and even Jews in the church age today are not bound to observe the Sabbath. So that's how we know he's talking about a yet future time. And he's not talking about first century Judaism either, because even believing Jews in 70 AD did not have to observe the Sabbath. God put an end to that when he died on the cross. The other thing too, and this is something that I overlooked the first time I read this, but look back in verse 15 at the very end, after he talks about the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. Let the reader understand. Although he's talking to the disciples, he's also talking to future people who are going to be reading this. Now, the Gospel of Matthew, there's a disagreement as far as when it was written. Usually somewhere between like 50 to 60 AD. The temple wasn't destroyed until 70 AD, but it's clearly that he's talking about a yet future time period than this. So although the temple was destroyed, and Jesus is prophesying here about the temple being destroyed and Jerusalem being burned down to the ground by the Romans, the abomination desolation is not talking about Nero destroying the temple, because he's talking about an abomination, an idol being actually placed in the temple, and this is going to happen with the Antichrist, in the future.
And what about verse 20?
Pray that your flight will not be in the winter or in the Sabbath.
Flight.
Well, here's another thing too. Under the Old Testament law, you could only go so far. You could only walk so far, especially like pregnant people and nursing babies or whatever. There's only so far that you could actually walk away from your home. and then you had to turn around and go back. You could only take so many steps, and it was under Old Testament law. Jewish Christians today don't have that restriction. They can go around the world if they want to. But in the future, there's going to be when there's a focus on the nation of Israel again, they're going to be practicing a lot of these Old Testament laws again. They're going to be reintroducing sacrifices. Because not that the sacrifices actually do anything, but the sacrifices were typological and they pointed towards Jesus as our sacrificial lamb. So just as the Old Testament sacrifices looked forward to the cross, the sacrifices and everything else in the future are going to be looking back to the cross of what Jesus did. So the ones in the past look to what Jesus was going to do, and the sacrifices in the future are going to look back to what Jesus did. So does that answer your question about the flight? Because
just flight.
Okay, flight just means that they can only walk so far. Okay, so walk so far. So, and the same with pregnant nursing babies. In those days they can only go so far too. I mean, so,
Is that why the woe unto them that are pregnant?
Yeah.
Okay.
Those who are pregnant nursing babies, and pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. Because can you imagine, it's winter time and it's cold and all this stuff is happening. But again, people still say that this is something happened in 70 AD. It's not something that's future. The very next verse, verse 21. For then there will be a great tribulation, and we're going to be getting into this next time because you notice great tribulation. This is a 7-year period in the future, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will be. So, if Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple and the Romans burning the temple in Jerusalem down to the ground, then how could everything that's going on here be so bad that it will never be as bad as this again? Because when you read through the book of Revelation, he makes it really clear that as bad as 70 AD was, when all this stuff happened, the worst period of human history is going to be in the future when the Antichrist comes during this 7-year tribulation. So when Jesus is talking about the abomination of desolation and the putting away of sacrifices, it's not talking about Jesus. This is what's known as a preterist view. And we've talked about this before, that a preterist are people that believe that everything that Jesus was talking about happened in the first century, which obviously couldn't happen because he's talking about a second coming too, and Jesus didn't come back in the first century. He's yet to do that. But rather the abomination and desolation and the putting away of sacrifices, according to Daniel chapter 11 and chapter 12, is yet future. It's going to happen in a time period in the future that we don't know when it's going to happen, but we know from Scripture that it will happen. Bill?
I was going to point out that when they destroyed the temple, millions of Jews, men, women, children, were slaughtered.
Yeah.
By the Romans. So it doesn't expressly say that here, but later on it does.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was absolutely horrible, and the worst part is that people think that Nero was the one that actually was responsible for that, and he ended up blaming the Christians, and that's when you start seeing the Christian especially the Jewish Christian persecution happening in the first century. After that, it was horrible. I mean, no matter what we go through here in the United States or anywhere else in the world, we can't even begin to fathom what believers happen in the world. But like the old saying goes, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and the church just exploded. I mean, the more they were persecuted, the bigger the church got. And that just really is evidence to me that Christianity is true, among other reasons, because when you see this happening with other religious movements, they die out. When they're persecuted. With Christianity, it just grows. You can't say that about Islam. You can't say that about Hinduism. You can't say that about atheism or secularism, Buddhism, whatever. Like as these people are killed, at least in the area, it begins to go down, and a lot of heresies and false forms of Christianity went by the wayside because of persecution. But what happened to the church? It exploded, especially in that first century. And when we read the book of Acts, at Pentecost, 3,000 people joined the church. Then later, 5,000 people. And by the end of the first century, it was like 1 million or something like that. It was just unbelievable. So for our next Bible study, because we're going to short here. We're going to be talking a little bit about his second coming, because he's going to go into the other part that the apostles had asked about, and about the Son of Man coming in the clouds and the great trumpet, and seeing these things. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the parable of the fig tree. What does the fig tree actually represent? Is it something that's happening now? Is it talking about Israel? And when he says Jesus says in verse 34, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." What generation is he talking about? Is he talking about the generation in the first century? Is he talking about the generation in the 20th century, since the nation of Israel was reformed in